Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon to all our viewers all around the world. And welcome to our final discussion on how we can unleash the global university. Our first four conversations focused on virtual conferences, international partnerships, and the undergraduate and postgraduate international experience. All of these were exploring different aspects of the same fundamental question. Does technology allow us to reimagine international activities, teaching, research, and networking in a more equal, sustainable way? What do we lose and what do we gain when we go virtual? Today, we are going to try to push that conversation still further. What changes when we go virtual? Does the embrace of technology change what we do as a global university in fundamental ways? In some ways, we are simply interrogating Marshall McLuhan's famous phrase that says the medium is the message. Almost 60 years ago, 60 years after he coined this phrase, we are facing technological changes at a speed that might stagger McLuhan, and we are still grappling with its implications. We will also find out today who are the technological optimists and pessimists among us. Let me nail my own colors to the mast. I'm an optimist, you know that already. I believe that we must not just seize opportunities, but we must lead them. It is an attitude shared by all of us at UCT. As we work on a new institutional strategy for the next decade, Vision 2030. As you recall, I started with the phrase, we ought to disrupt ourselves. And just before we did, COVID came and did it for us, so we didn't have to disrupt ourselves. So, what does the future look like? And what are the implications for the global university? Firstly, I believe the future of higher education is definitely blended, a combination of physical and virtual interactions. What remains is to figure out how to blend. As I always say, we've got to explore the different models of our blended future. And that, I think, is the only thing that remains. What will the blended approach look like? And you will not be surprised, given what I have just said, that I believe a focus on blended learning comes with opportunities, some of which may help us to make a much bigger contribution in terms of creating possibilities for access to higher education for students who qualify, but we don't have enough space to accommodate them. And maybe, just maybe, a blended future or a blended approach might create an opportunity, of course, depending on what brand of blended we go for. That depends, of course, on the blended approach to teaching and learning that we have. There are many ways of doing this, including rotating groups of students so that they have face-to-face learning at different times. They might even have an opportunity for blocked learning on a rotation where one block is face-to-face, one is online, and a third is in a work placement, getting real-world experience that can go on a CV that students desperately need when they go into the world of work. This blended future creates just such an opportunity, and we have to think outside the box to grab the opportunity. With large online components incorporated into all teaching, it becomes easier to create fully online courses for international students, both undergraduates and postgraduates on taught courses. I believe that the blended future also applies to conferences and workshops. There are several models for blended events here too. For instance, people in regional hubs attend in person, while those who would have had to travel long distances can choose to attend or present virtually. The current situation calls on us to rethink what being an academic is about. It is not just about face-to-face teaching and research, but also about being functional in a virtual space. We have to interrogate the question, what does it mean to develop a useful, productive, virtual global, or to develop useful, productive, virtual communities of practice? In fact, I think when we induct new academics, we've got to induct them into this idea of developing virtual communities of practice. It also creates opportunities for us as a university, for all staff to be comfortable with people working from home. Universities will need to develop a robust policy for this. We need to rethink why we need people on campus. Do we need everyone on campus all the time? I think it's old-fashioned because it assumes you are more productive or you are functioning better when you are at work or physically on campus. The lockdown this lockdown brought about by the pandemic has exploded this notion. At the same time, we need to recognize that for some people, physical presence is a necessity, not just because of the nature of their work or studies, but because maybe it provides a safe space with access to facilities. Of course, we also have to think about what's the value of physical connection in building a community. These questions were not so relevant before the lockdown that's brought by the pandemic. And if we apply this flexibility of working from home or this flexibility to internationalization, should all our academic staff live in the same city as the university, which is their primary home? Many academics have honorary positions with universities elsewhere in the world. Could this apply to full-time academics too? As we push these boundaries of innovation, we need to make sure that by doing things differently, we are doing them better. We need to make sure that we embrace technology in ways that increase diversity and inclusivity, and in ways that disrupt ancient power imbalances and ways that keep the planet and the well-being of its people at the forefront. This has cost and even political implications to ensure we do not create digital divides that simply reinforce inequalities we are attempting to overcome. And we need to do this while adding to the value of what we do. A blended learning model should be better for all students as a teaching and learning experience. It should enrich our research endeavors, and it should strengthen our global networks. How can we ensure that this disrupted future is an improvement on the old? That's the question. How do we ensure that? That is what our esteemed panel tonight will be discussing. They will be introduced and led by Professor Laura Chinowitz, Director of Center for Innovation and Learning at UCT. And we know that SILS has been leading the way in blended and online learning technologies, not just at UCT, but they're a respected player in this field. Laura is one of our most innovative thinkers who combines proactive thought with a deep commitment to social justice and a correction of power imbalances. And we're very delighted not only to have her in our midst as a colleague, but to have her tonight moderating this event. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor, for your warm words and for setting the stage for a truly thought-provoking conversation this evening. As the Vice Chancellor's outlined for us, we're asking critical questions tonight about how changing the medium of engagement in research and teaching and social responsiveness changes the nature of these relationships locally and globally. Look, even before the pandemic, it was becoming evident that the future of higher education would be digitally mediated. Now, working, researching, teaching and learning from home, if we're lucky, there's no doubt that it will be. Even about 25 years ago, writing in The Rise of the Networked Society, the great sociologist Manuel Castells argued that the internet changed the nature of networks by making them more inclusive and easy to participate in. What an optimist he was. The years since Castells wrote those words have seen higher education become more corporatized and individualistic. In these months of the pandemic, there have been examples of both exclusion and serious and dire inequality, but also collaboration and generosity. So how can Castells' optimism be reclaimed so that technology enables skewed and inequitable power relations to become more equitable? For the next hour, with the help of our esteemed panel, we're going to unpack this and related questions. We're honored tonight to have in this final event a lineup of deeply thoughtful, charismatic participants who are prepared to challenge conventional thinking. The guests we've invited to join the discussion tonight bring with them an extraordinary range of rich experience and deep expertise on the intersection of the knowledge project and the changing nature of universities with the technological frameworks which have been so foregrounded in recent months. I'm going to introduce each person very briefly before they speak. Briefly so that we have more time to hear them speak. Such short summaries, of course, cannot do justice to the depth and breadth of their expertise. So I'm also going to post links in the chat which provide more extensive information regarding their scholarship and knowledge domains. And I'll also include their Twitter handles as they're all online. I'm going to introduce, I start with going alphabetically backward. So I'll start with Professor Nagla Rizk. Nagla Rizk, and everyone is very happy to have their first names used. I have checked with them. Nagla Rizk is Professor of Economics and Founding Director of the Access to Knowledge for Development Center at the American University in Cairo. She's also a Faculty Associate at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society and an affiliated Fellow of Yale Law School. Nagla's research interests include the economics of knowledge, technology and development, digital platforms, innovation, knowledge governance, and artificial intelligence and inclusion. She plays a leading role in numerous research projects, including the Open African Innovation Research Project based in the law faculty here at the University of Cape Town, which is committed to recognizing Africa's role in the global knowledge economy and discovering which knowledge governance policies will best ensure that the social and economic benefits of innovation are shared inclusively. Nagla, you're perfectly placed to contribute and kickstart tonight's discussion. Thank you for joining us. And I'm going to ask you the opening question, which is, how have changes in higher education during the pandemic opened up possibilities for new international relationships and new forms of governance?
Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you very much, everyone, Vice Chancellor. I'm going to get straight to the point to make good use of my time. It's an honor to be here. And let me just start by reminding everyone how the pandemic hits universities like a meteor. Overnight, we were pushed into a paradigm shift. And this is a seismic change. And like the Vice Chancellor, I'd like to think of this as an opportunity, as being an optimist. It's an opportunity to harness our creativity and shape a new normal of globally inclusive teaching, learning, and research. Now, basically, the issues, the paradoxes that are inherent in the digital economy are actually inherent in teaching and learning and the technologies. So now there is a chance of being, as we saw in the live video, of exacerbating inequalities and the digital divide being exposed, but also there is a chance for us to turn things around and use this disruption, use the technologies to overcome this disruption. So I make 2 points. First, related to educational content. What does it mean? What are we going to study given the challenges that we are facing today? There are issues related to interdisciplinarity of knowledge. Now we need to think of knowledge as from different angles, from an interdisciplinary approach. The most important, I think, issue of opportunity that comes to us as knowledge workers in the Global South is how we can share our knowledge, how educational curricula and programs should actually be a level field in the global knowledge map and architecture. Now there is a chance to bring in more content from our parts of the world to learners from other parts of the globe. We learn from each other. We share our knowledge together. New hands-on experiences, great opportunities for open access, for open educational resources, also no more silos in educational programs, alternative to new ways of thinking outside the box, alternatives to the mainstream university degree. I just read about Google's professional certificate, but I'm sure there are many other opportunities for teaching and learning in addition to what we do as teachers in universities in mainstream degrees, or continuing education, executive education, more opportunities to learn while working, given more time and the more flexibility given from learning from home, more learning opportunities for women and people in remote geographical areas. The most important thing is that now the Vice Chancellor mentioned Marshall McLuhan is also the global village of learning. Now we need to think as a collective, as global learning. We need to think of different models. For example, what will the institutional structure of a university be? We are looking at a multi-campus consortia of universities, perhaps, internationalization of content and also of establishments. We're looking at joint teaching and learning research networks. We're looking at joint curricula with content from the South, courses that are interchangeably taught in different parts of the world. I think it's a great opportunity for voices of different parts of the world to come out to contribute to the global knowledge content and make sure that we are in this process together with novel thinking, novel ways of doing things. And I will stop there to make, to leave time for my panelists. Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. That was so thought-provoking. I'm going to move to introducing the wonderful Professor Monica Kerrets-Makau. Dr. Monica Kerrets-Makau is the academic director at Thunderbird's Center for Excellence for Africa. She's based at, she's in Machakos near Nairobi, Kenya, and is also Professor of Practice in Global Leadership and Management, teaching the online master's classes for the US class. Her passion and work focus on governance and leadership, change management and communications, and ICT for development policy. Monica has received numerous accolades, including the top 100 reputational Africans, the top 100 influential Africans, and top women in ICT in Africa. She has extensive continental and international consulting experience, including for the World Bank, NEPAD, and she's on the board of numerous prestigious organizations, and we will be posting a link to her profile. So Monica, you said, COVID is not an indiscriminate assassin of higher education. It is a disruptively creative change management consultant working pro bono. We were intrigued by this comment. And so our question to you is, in what ways has higher education been substantially disrupted for the long term by the technology-enabled move to teaching, learning, and researching and collaborating online? Is disruption always a good thing? And how can it be leveraged for the greater good of Africa?
Thank you, Laura, for that introduction, and great to be with such a good team. I'm going to get started and say, I think first it's the politicization of space, the ideology that education has to be physically situated in a place. And I think that disruption is great. I think it's phenomenal. And it's mind-boggling for a lot of professors who are used to going to a place, for students who are used to going to a place. Why has it been that we have conceptualized education as place? Why has our content and pedagogy of teaching been about place? So that, for example, I am unable to learn agriculture within an agricultural setting. Why is it that I have to do it only in class? And COVID-19 is beginning to question our ideology of how we conceptualize learning. I think the second thing that it's doing and why disruption is great is because we're beginning to ask ourselves questions around emergency remote learning versus online learning. And Lara, you're one of those who's always talked about this, and I want to highlight this very specifically. This is telling us universities that we are really not prepared to do online learning, especially in Africa. And what we were doing and what we've been doing has never been in a thought process. Many of us have had learning centers and have had remote, some online form of learning. And today what we have seen in Africa and many places, and when people speak about online learning, they're really referring to emergency remote learning. They're not referring to the thought process of teaching online. The actual process of removing and of distributed learning, of blended learning. And so really, I think it must be disruptive because we must begin to change our notions of learning and what that learning really looks like. And that disruption must come with the question of place. I think the second thing I want to highlight that disruption is great is because it begins to allow us to teach and talk from different places. Look at this workshop. I know everybody's tired of webinars, but we're able to have content and to have people speak about places and spaces and issues. For example, I always talk about the 5 apocalypses of Africa. Whenever teaching is being taught, it's taught about war, disease, famine, poverty, and name it. But now we're able to begin to speak about issues that affect Africa by Africans themselves, not by a white American, white British living in Africa, speaking for Africans, not about international people who have been in Africa for 6 months or a year and suddenly they know about Africa. We're beginning to allow Africans who live in Africa, who understand place, context, and knowledge about that area to begin to speak about these issues. And I think this is fundamentally challenging a lot of people, a lot of institutions, because now we're able to allow those who should be speaking for themselves. And I want to highlight here Africans who should be speaking for themselves, and hence extremely disruptive to our notions of learning, to our notions of thinking, to our ideas of how we understand people and place. Do you want me to stop there, Lara, and allow you to come back later?
I don't want you to stop, but I think I'd better ask you to stop and ask you to come back later. Kate, you are very welcome. Kate Bowles, Dr. Kate Bowles is Associate Dean International for the Faculty of Arts, Science, Social Science and Humanities, the University of Wollongong in Australia, with a disciplinary background in cultural studies. Kate is a public intellectual, widely known for her astute commentaries and analysis on her blog, Music for Deck Chairs, which we will also be sharing, which was named by The Guardian as one of the top education blogs in Australia. One of the blog's recommenders said, "I think I'd enjoy a blog post from Kate that insulted my whole family. Her writing is that good." Kate's work embodies a commitment to analysing key structural features of higher education, the potential of technology to overcome barriers of distance and create novel forms of learner community online, and the problems that the same technologies introduce for labour justice in a casualizing profession. She's been working in university internationalisation in a senior governance role for several years, adding a third structural feature to her analysis of higher education, the marketisation of international education. So Kate, a question for you is that you've spoken previously about the need to respect students' courage in the face of a world defined by dispossession and loss. And you've argued that academics too need to take risks. In an era where technology mediates and shapes new forms of partnerships and relationships, what risks should be taken and for what ends?
Thank you. And it's lovely to be here. Thank you for this warm welcome. I'm very stimulated by what has just been said. And I want to start by explaining why I think courage matters at this time, why we need to bring courage to our response to COVID. I have the privilege of working in a role that allows me to advocate for students. And international students are having an extraordinarily difficult year in universities around the world. They're facing this crisis largely on their own, separated from their families, in very unfamiliar and frightening situations. In Australia, we've seen unprecedented numbers of international students fall rapidly into poverty. We are running food banks on our campuses because they have no other means of support. And when I look at these young people who are determinedly pursuing their education in the face of the most appalling disruption, all I think is how courageous they are, how courageous their families are, and what a future they're going to build by developing this courage under such difficult circumstances. And then I look at us and I think, how courageous are we? What do we do to match their courage? What do we do to earn it? And I look at universities scrambling to mitigate risk, to avoid risk, to manage and minimize the impact of this event on our institutional lives and our businesses. And I think we need to become more courageous in order to rebuild universities after what is an extraordinary financial shock that will continue for several years after this. We are not going to climb out of COVID quickly. Our sectors worldwide are now in absolute crisis. And we're going to need courage to be imaginative and not fearful at this time. Our urge is to preserve. We feel so under threat that we're clinging to the things that we've always done and wondering how to do them online. Most universities have managed to produce some form of lecturing online instead of letting go of lecturing. We've reproduced the credit hour online instead of stopping. We've taken screenshots of Zoom calls in order to replace the attendance policy that we had in the room. So I want to follow up with Monica's point and say, do we have the courage, while we're challenging place, also to challenge time itself? Time is the basis of everything that we do. We have very conservative ideas about time. Learning is what happens when students spend a certain amount of time in a room. Pay is what happens when people spend a certain amount of time at work. And revenue is what happens when time to degree is a predictable pipeline of money into universities. Time has gone wrong with COVID. I wonder if we have the courage to move on that and to embrace, just as we've unsettled place, also embrace that time itself is now unsettled. So I think that's what I really want to open with, is the courage that we need to show at this time is the courage that our students are already showing, and we just need to join them. So back to you, Laura, with that. That's my thought on that.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you to Monica and Nagla for your provocations. What I am going to do now is ask the three of you if there's anything you would like to, rather than simply go to the next set of questions where we all speak, if there's anything you'd like to pick up on what each other has said, or you'd like to ask one another.
I'd like to jump in quickly with something that I was listening to Monica and really thinking about what is implied behind the question that we've been asked. How do we change the way of doing things? I think that's such a rich question, and I'd like to ask others what we think we first need to do before we change it to understand it. How well do we understand why we do the things we do in education?
You know, I like your question because it begins to ask us the question, why do we learn? And maybe for a long time, we have learned in a certain format and a certain way. And you're asking us to disrupt time, or to question time, to question price, to question what is understood to be a student and a professor. And that whole learning cycle, the cycle of learning, is what we're beginning to ask ourselves with COVID-19. And I want to come back to the issue of social justice. And why do we learn, and how do we learn, and how do we allow everybody to be part of learning? How do we remove the commodization of learning? How do we remove it from a revenue issue? How do we allow people in remote areas? I live in a remote area of Kenya. I'm only able to do this because, you know, Safaricom and everybody is really supporting me to be able to talk from Machakos. And I know that there are many that cannot do this from the place I am in remote parts of different countries, in Africa. So how do we learn? But not only that, how do we allow everybody to be part of learning? And I think it's an important question, and we must put those two together to begin to think about social justice of education and to remove education from being an elitist part. And COVID-19, as I said, isn't discriminate because elitism is being challenged. Yet at the same time, elitism is becoming more popular because those who have technology are able to use online systems. So while it's being challenged, we also have a growing elitism at the same time. How do universities reconceptualize and deconstruct learning for social justice? I think those are important, and that we must begin to say, how does social justice look like in education for everyone?
Thank you. And Nagla, you wanted to pick up on that?
Yes, thank you, Laura, and thank you, Monica and Kate. I think in the spirit of raising questions and questioning our role, I think it's important to ask, what is the role of the university? Why are we as educators employed by universities? Why are we there? The university, again, moving away from the corporate model, the university has a role for the community, for society, for the public good. And this takes us back to knowledge as a public good. Knowledge is a public good. Knowledge is not a private good. Knowledge, the value of knowledge increases by sharing. And one extra user doesn't actually take away from the use of knowledge, but adds to it. So in that sense, knowledge is non-rival, and the pure nature of a knowledge good means that it has to be available for all. Now, how does the institution raise revenue is another story. Then you look at alternative ways of raising revenues, which is the typical classic issue and the problem of the public good issue, and that applies to education, to learning, to music, to culture, you name it. So it is an issue, and it just surfaces now more than any other time, specifically because of what Monica points to, which is also I alluded to in the beginning of my answer, is that digital technologies have a paradox. The paradox is that they can exacerbate inequalities, and at the same time, they can be used around, if used consciously, to mitigate inequality. So where are we from this tension, and what is the role of the university and our role as educators and as agents of change? Thank you. That was my quick comment based on my colleagues' comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You're raising such profound questions, and I keep hearing this. I will come back to our questions and our topic, but I keep hearing this thread that gets mentioned, that's in the background, about commodification and corporatization, and I'm really curious to explore that in the current climate. And maybe we're going to be able to come back to that, because we're all treating it as a kind of a given, but really, is it a given? And I think that's something I'm going to come back and ask you, Monica.
Can I just say, something on that, Laura? I think universities cannot be silos, and for a long time, universities have been silos. And now I'm speaking to Africa. I'm speaking to the fact that maybe in the West there's more a sense in which, when you're watching the media, when any topic is being spoken about, the universities tend to be the places where you go for information. It's the places where you go to seek a body of knowledge on an issue. And in Africa and many African countries, the ideology of university being part of day-to-day process and system of lived experience within a society hasn't necessarily been ubiquitous, and hasn't necessarily been such that they are in tandem. Governments have never really, are not really working in hand with universities, so that the commodification of education has a reason, because we have allowed private universities to really surpass the thought process of what public universities can support, because we are not thinking holistically. We're not thinking about the ideology of industry, academia, government coexisting as one. And how does that look like? And I think, COVID-19 is beginning to show that there has to be a place for this kind of conversation, because unless you do so, we are going to be dealing with fruits instead of the root problem. And I think this is important for us to begin to ask those questions.
My goodness, I'm going to go back to some of the questions that I thought I would ask you, because they're issues that I really would like you to address. But before I do so, I have to tell you that we have discovered that for technological reason, there we are, technology, Achille Mbembe is not going to be able to join us, which is just one of the ironies of this kind of situation. So I really am hoping that we will be able to take another opportunity to have him with us and participate in these discussions. And I hope that the recording will provoke him to have many thoughts that he will choose to share with us. But it does mean that we have more time for you wonderful women to share your thoughts with us. So Nagla, I'm going to come back to you and ask you, I mean, you spoke a little bit about funding and about the environment of austerity. How can universities engage with a transformation agenda and a sustainable development agenda when our institutions and our own sector faces their own serious and maybe existential sustainability issues?
Thank you for the question, Laura. Let me build on my earlier comment. I think universities are now facing what newspapers and music records faced a few years ago. The question is, if you provide a content that in essence should be shared Where do you get your value from? What is your add-on? What differentiates you as a provider of a knowledge good that will actually warrant receiving a financial return? And this is it's an issue that to grapple with. And there are different models, again, looking back at examples from newspapers until today, the music industry, the movie industry, all these knowledge production, culture production industries are grappling with these issues. Come universities, they have their special circumstances. I would say one way of working in other, including actually the book publishing industry, is versioning content. You usually provide content that is available online for free, if you will, in books, and you can provide an e-book. You can also provide a hardcover book that is, more expensive, and a paperback, etc. Just thinking of the concept of versioning, very simply explained by me in this context, how can university play its role in society and at the same time raise, get a financial return? For one thing that I would believe, and this is one thing we're working on within my university, is that some content should be available for free. And perhaps you can provide different pay, pay depending on situation. I teach a Harvard course that a version of it is available online, and students in developing countries can join for free, but students in the global north have to pay fees. So you version your content, you provide content that is available for different prices, price differencing, that's totally legitimate. The other thing is that if the university is going to play a role in the community, there is nothing wrong with partnering with corporates, with telecom, for example, because there are connectivity issues that my colleagues have mentioned. How can you reach students in remote parts of the country? You need partnership with the telecom. Telecoms can fund university content that, and at the same time, encourage connectivity, work together towards serving education in the community, teaching and learning in the community. So different models, sponsorships, partnerships, encouraging, price differencing, actually working with other universities globally through partnerships. At the end of the day, there has to be novel business models. There is no one answer, and industries, as I mentioned, like the media, newspapers, until today, the music industry are trying to find novel business models to deal with those issues. So I think it's very important that universities are aware that the model of depending on fees and student fees and other donations itself is not enough. There has to be novel models of partnerships as well in the global south, education apps with entrepreneurs, new simple technologies that can be done for less privileged to be able to reach educational content. One of the things actually is that we always think of connectivity in terms of internet connectivity, but sometimes all you need is working through the radio, simple technologies, TVs, mobile technologies, simple apps. So the engagement, I guess my point here is that the engagement of universities with different partners, thinking of different and novel ways of delivering the educational service in a way that differentiates this institution will actually provide alternatives for and business models that would actually bring financial return in addition to the role of the university as, and at the end of the day, an educational institution in society. Thank you very much. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you so much. And in fact, your question leads so beautifully to the question that I had in my mind to ask Monica. So I'm going to actually move straight on to asking you, Monica. How can we ensure that the free diffusion of knowledge and how can we ensure the free diffusion of knowledge and prevent its commodification by profit-driven interests? And particularly, how can academics organize themselves and set up organizational and logistical structures to campaign for this? How can we do that, especially now when we're so exhausted? And is it really possible to think of the relationship between scientists and industry and communication as win-win? How realistic is that in the current moment?
Lara, you're asking a hard question because, someone even said in the question chat, academics are not necessarily great at change management. We're not great at moving the wheel. Universities tend to be slow. We've been slower. So when you begin to then ask, COVID-19 beginning to ask to reimagine the wheel changing, You're asking a lot from universities. We have to admit that first and foremost. We're asking a lot from professors who tend to be very fixed in ways and modes of doing things. But then how do we prevent commodification? In Africa, and I want to speak for us as being in Africa and speaking for myself. We're using Teams, we're using all these technologies that are out based there. What happened to our different forms of options for freeloading on creativity outside commodification tools? So free online systems that we could use. What happened to them? What happened to open source? I remember South Africa was once the government that was leading in Africa, for open source in government. I don't know whether it still is. But there was, what happened to open source? What happened to the ability for us as academics to begin to question why we can't use open source? We've all, universities are all going into the text outside open source. But I think a lot has to do with the fact that we fear tech. We pretend to like it, but we fear it. And so because we fear it, those who know about it tend to be in silos. So for example, online learning has existed and scientifically existed as a body of people alone. You, Lara, and many of you have just been, you're there, but it's a group, and a group that talks to each other. What happened to that ability to move across to different schools so that you don't have these silos where they're, tech systems and everything? So how do we reconceptualize commodification? I don't know whether professors, I don't know whether we are at the place where we're willing to quickly change. I think we can change, but I don't know whether that wheel is fast enough. Can we share a body of knowledge together? I think we can. I think COVID is beginning to allow us to speak to each other more scientifically. And we're able to then say, let's speak together, let's work together. I think that's possible, and it's being created. If it comes to field trips, I'm teaching, the Africa field seminar class, to a totally US class, and they're not able to fly in. And, the online cannot replace being on the ground. There's certain things that online will never replace. So I'm consciously aware of that as I'm conceptualizing the syllabus, as I'm conceptualizing learning. How do you teach about, being in the context of place? So there's scientifically things that may not be fully done online, and we've got to accept that. But at the same time, we've got to allow for the blendedness of both to exist.
And you've raised some interesting questions about intellectual property, which I think academics tend to think is outside of their domain and something really boring. And you talk about copyright and academics close down. But actually, I think intellectual property regimes are actually shutting us down, even while we're not looking. And I must say, I fear that the focus that we all have simply on surviving this terrible period in higher education means that there are so many things we're not seeing that we're going to see later, and I hope that it's not too late.
I think it's important, Lara, as you're saying that, you see, tech has been commoditized, and we've got to accept that. It's owned by people, it's private. We've got to come back to open source systems and begin to challenge those tech spaces and say, should it be private? Can we re-challenge them? Can we question them? Europe has been great with asking us about privacy, and Europe has led the way on those issues. How about we begin to lead the way on all this tech issue, on tech, and what is allowed to be, whose spaces are they? Whose knowledge is it? Whose knowledge, who keeps my knowledge? Who gets to keep my knowledge when I teach on this, commodified instruments? I think we can begin to have those questions and challenge them.
You certainly are challenging us, especially the question of, do we accept that technology has to be private? I think this is a good moment to ask you a question that I've been wanting to ask you, Kate. You're currently teaching a course on the future of work. So under austerity, we've seen higher education itself becoming part of the gig economy. And now the situation for all university workers is becoming precarious, and as international travel is restricted. So how can the challenges of increasing casualization of academic work be mitigated?
I'll give a quick answer to this, because I think we've got such great questions in the Q&A that it would be really good to get some of them. So specifically, I think that COVID in a number of industries has exposed casualization of work broadly as a significant social risk, running counter to all of the hopes we have for social justice. In Australia, COVID itself has travelled around networks of casual workers moving between jobs who can't afford to take leave, can't afford to miss a shift. And we've now suddenly started a conversation at the national level about casualization, which I think is a really important one. When we turn to universities, we find that our own employers are some of the worst offenders. So major prestigious universities in Australia have found themselves responsible for wage theft. Now, this is really on our watch. But precarity has now spread to people who thought that they were secure, that they had something that looked a bit like tenure, that they would continue in a stable profession, stable role until they chose to retire. And this is really not the case now because everything is on fire. I think that we need to temper our optimism. I'm not suggesting that we should become pessimistic, but we need to be very cautious about being optimistic on the basis of the experience of the minority in this profession.
Yes.
And look instead at the experience of the majority, many of whom are really setting themselves up for a lifetime of low-income work because we've not found a way to give them sustainable jobs at the start of their careers. I'm not sure we have a sustainable teaching model anymore. I think it's broken. I've heard senior executives say that the problems of casualization will be solved by technology because students will be taught by AI. And I think that if that is how we think we're going to solve a human labour problem, we ourselves are now contributing to one of the worst global social problems, which is the chronic lack of justice in global labour. I'd like to say no more than that, really. This is an issue that I think we cannot fix quickly, but it is the issue that should restrain us when we're being optimistic. It doesn't mean we should be pessimistic, but if we are optimistic because we're not looking at this problem, we are setting forth in a boat with a hole in it.
Thank you very much. I'm trying not to get too depressed by the thought of the boat with the hole. Nagla, you've done work on artificial intelligence and inclusion. Perhaps you'd like to comment on what Kate was saying about the future of work?
Yes, thank you very much. Sure. I think with artificial intelligence, again, there is this debate about, the AI taking over work, which I totally agree with, and I see Kate's point 100%. Now, the question here is what happens to developing countries? That's even more challenging because AI will, in general, is likely, just like we spoke earlier, is likely to create more, exacerbate inequalities and create more jobs lost. Now, in our part of the world, when the skill level that is, we have a high percentage of jobs that are medium skills, and these are the easiest ones to be replaced by machines. So there is definitely a challenge for more inequality using AI. And again, in that sense, the introduction of technology has to be sensitive for the less privileged cohorts of society, and inclusion has to be on the top priorities on the ethics of AI. Because at the end of the day, a machine is as good as what it can do, but machines are part of society. So context matters. And this is really something that I hope is taken in consideration globally, but also in the global south, perhaps more so. Because you mentioned intellectual property, and that's so dear to my heart. And you mentioned open source, which I'm 100% in agreement with you. And again, the logic of open source is very similar to what I spoke about earlier about the media and universities. In fact, the logic comes from open source because the argument here is what is non-differentiating should be available for free, and value added comes from what differentiates a package of software. So that logic applies to different forms of production. The mantra becomes, give out the recipe but open a restaurant, because you give out the knowledge of the recipe, everybody knows how the dish is made, but you pay for the experience of the restaurant. You pay for the add-on comes from the experience. So by the same logic, thinking of universities, how can the experience of learning be differentiated in a way that warrants and justifies the payment that is made in return? I also want to comment on scholarship, because there is a need to change the culture. And usually culture of academia globally looks at journal articles, publications in top-tier journals, which are usually, like it or not, centered on issues related to the global north. Usually academics from the global south face a challenge in publication, maybe because their topics are not of global interest, maybe because they're more depending on practical and empirical examples, which may not necessarily be required on the global theoretical framework in scholarship. So there is a problem for academic scholarship, and perhaps what is happening today is time to allow research outputs that are diversified, that are varied, and that are actually open access, and open up this limited, locked in corner of the necessity of journal publication in a top-tier journal. Well, guess what? There are so many forms of, expression of academic expressions. There are many forms of academic content that is definitely rigorous, but can be presented different forms coming from Africa, from Latin America, from Australia, from the global south, from Asia. And this, I think, will sort of balance the level, the playing field for academic content, and everybody will benefit and learn. Thank you.
The one question that people are asking and have really are asking the panel is what's going to change for research? And that picks up on what you were saying, Nagla, I think very well. How does what's happened in the pandemic affect research? Can these kinds of blended formats really work for the kind of research collaboration and meetings that are needed for research projects? So who would like to answer that question first?
Let me try it a little bit, and by quoting somebody. I'd like to quote Laila Watson. I don't know that you know her. And she said, "If you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." And there's a reason I like that quote, because it's related to research. What COVID-19 is going to do with allowing research is to begin to ask us, who is coming to help the liberation that is bound up together? So that we're not just doing research for research's sake, so that we can have a tick box to be professor and rise up the hierarchy of academia and get all this USAID fundings and Danida and FIDA and whoever else it is, all these different types of fundings. But we're beginning to say, is our liberation bound up together? And so that research stops being for research's sake. And so can research work together? I think COVID-19 is beginning to allow so that we find the right people that can work on research together, and we're not different people just speaking for the sake of speaking with each other. So I just wanted to say that and quote her, because I feel many times that we tend sometimes as academics do research for research's sake. And not really in trying to ensure that the liberation is bound up together. Chimamanda talked about the danger of a single story. Africa is not a single story. Somebody talked about the fact that how can you talk about global universities in Africa? Well, Africa is unified. It's not single stories. There's not only poverty. There are people who are doing different things. There's different things within Africa. There are no single stories, and research must begin to address the issue that it's not a single story. Africa is a continent with 54 plus countries. We cannot speak about Africa anymore just like that. We've got to readdress and re-examine the way we even speak about the continent, and remember that it's always a continent, never a country.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you for reminding us about the skewed and inequitable relationships that so often happen in research relationships. And hopefully this period has given us some glimmers of alternative forms of relationships. Would either of you, Kate or Nagla, like to comment on how research can be changed as a result of this? And there's a related question that you might also want to touch on, because I'm mindful of time, around internationality and how this might also be reconceptualized during this period.
I really would just like to say, I think in terms of internationality, COVID has prepared us to imagine climate change better. I think that we've seen something hit the whole world. We need not to lose that insight.
Yes, I think also COVID has, there was a comment earlier about how COVID was equalizing in the sense that everybody is subjected to the virus. And I think it's about time that we look at issues, at research issues in its totality, in its human sense. So we all have similar research issues. There are definitely context-related issues, but this is a chance for research to spread within research networks and to bring voice from different contexts. One of the things we do within the Open African Innovation Research Network is precisely that. We work on research that brings up the voice of Africa and brings scholarship from Africa to provide grounded theory. This is what we do within Open Air, but also within research that we do in other networks at the American University in Cairo. I guess the point being that it's about time that research is open for different participants on issues that touch people's lives in different parts of the world, and it's not just restricted to a narrow corner of theoretical research that is very much sort of global north specific. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to be, to make any offense, but really at the end of the day, a lot of the world's problems are happening on the ground and need to be tackled through research, through multi-national different networks from different research points, and with data collected firsthand, and not through, just theoretical from a desk, but rather from the people working on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You've touched on so many important issues that I was hoping Ashil Mbembe would be talking to, particularly around horizontal forms of knowledge production and pluriversalism. But I think you've actually raised that really well. And unfortunately, frustrated as I am to bring this incredibly stimulating conversation to a close, the time has come for me to hand back to our Vice Chancellor for the wrap up and the final words.
Thanks very much, Laura. Thank you. Really, really wonderful, wonderful evening. Thank you so much to Nagla, Monica, and Kate for this enriching and stimulating discussion. It was really, really, we could have gone on and on. I don't know what would have happened if Ashil was here, then we wouldn't have had enough time to hear all of your thoughts. As Monica asked during the discussion, why have we conceptualized education as place? And I think this is a question that we have to keep asking ourselves. Why have we conceptualized education as place? Do we have the courage to challenge time itself? That's what Kate asked. I'm so pleased that we are asking these questions, among others, because we need to understand and interrogate what we know to be true when it comes to higher education. How do we enable everyone to be part of the education project? In many ways, this discussion was not just about online learning, it was about social justice. And that's exactly what COVID has done. This pandemic has brought many compelling questions to the surface, and we can no longer avoid how to address issues of equity and inequality in the higher education space. Ever since I stepped into the leadership position at UCT, I've been committed to disrupting this space to make UCT more accessible. Some might argue more human or more inclusive. And making higher education more accessible is not to say we are making it less exceptional, because sometimes there's a misconception that when you make higher education more accessible, you are lowering the standards. It's not about the fact that we want to make it less exceptional in terms of the knowledge project. Quite the opposite is true. In my mind, this discussion highlights the power of diversity. Discussing how virtual learning is transforming the globalization of higher education is crucial. But it's even more important. What's even more important is to interrogate what open access means. If we can't open it to everyone who wants to experience it, then what does it mean? Why do we call it open if we can't open it to everyone who wants to experience it? Whilst this is the last in our series of challenging conversations, I hope that it has stimulated further debate and discussion on your campuses and in your homes. Fittingly, a core component of UCT's Vision 2030 is to unleash and disrupt the work that we do in a positive way. And as I said earlier this evening, though completely unexpected, the pandemic has given us the opportunity to do exactly that. As is so clear, business as usual is not going to transform our institution. It's not going to transform our country or our continent. Through our challenging conversations, we have engaged with rethinking how we offer how we offer globalization of higher education and conduct research. But facilitating these kinds of debates within 1 hour has been a challenge in itself. We always want to go beyond an hour. The questions we've received from viewers over the 5 webinars have far outnumbered the minutes available to answer them. However, I hope that these conversations have served as a catalyst for other debates and discussions on your campuses and in your homes. Certainly for us at UCT, they are doing exactly that. We are engaging with issues that come out of these webinars. In my position as Vice Chancellor at UCT, I've certainly found the series to be a useful forum for encountering new ideas and approaches. In closing, I'd like to thank the following groups and individuals who have been instrumental in running this event: the participants and moderators of each individual event, some of whom had to join after midnight to accommodate the difference in time zones. Thank you also to UCT's Communications and Marketing Department, the super team. They pull off events like nothing else. The Global Strategy and Visibility team at the Research Office, always on point, always on task. Thank you so much for the work that you do. The Program Committee, Professor Sue Harrison, Professor Kelly Chibale, Professor Salome Maswime, Professor Katie Alteri, and Carolyn Newton. Thank you so much for engaging with the idea, making it come to life in this powerful manner. UCT's Information and Communications Technology Services Department, who have come to our tech rescue and have helped us run these events in the thick of load shedding. I say it every day, our ICTS team is a super team. It's like the hero of the lockdown period. And lastly, I'd like to thank those of you who have tuned in to watch these live events. I hope you have found them as useful as we have, at least in the leadership and in the institution. Thank you for making them alive through the questions that you ask, engaging the speakers that we have invited. Thank you very much. Have a good evening, or a good morning, or a good day.